My name is Patrick. You can call me Brother Patch. I know nothing, and you should not take my word for anything. I'm currently getting my brakes and pads changed so I can continue to drive for Uber. I thought I'd use this downtime to share some of my thoughts on Hyper Sigils. Around 10 years ago, I wrote and drew a web comic called Monster Truck, and then I uploaded that online. And within a short period of time, I realized that the things that happened to the lead character of the comic were happening to me in my real life. I knew about Grant Morrison and his comic The Invisibles and how he described it as a hyper sigil, and so that became the explanation that I landed on. Because I wasn't really comfortable with the answer, it was magic, and because I'm a rationalist living in a rational culture, I kept looking for continued explanations. One of the things I stumbled upon was Carl Jung's theory of the Transcendent Function. In the Transcendent Function, a person is going through a hard time in their life. They're having a conscious block to forward movement and progress. And they have their ego way of dealing with things. Like, here's how I, as a conscious being, think I should deal with this problem. And their unconscious mind, which contains the multitude of things that they don't hold in their own consciousness, comes up with a different solution. And that conscious solution and the unconscious solution kind of stand in conflict. They're kind of held in tension. Your unconscious mind thinks you should do one thing, and you consciously think you should do something else. And so because of that conflict, the transcendent function happens. And what that is that conflict creates a fantasy image. And that fantasy image contains the combination of the 2 points of view as a new solution. And the fantasy part is really hard to kind of wrap our minds around, because when we think of fantasy, we think of Lord of the Rings and like swords and sorcery and stuff. But I don't think that's what Jung is referring to when he says fantasy. He's talking about the fact that our unconscious mind, and even our conscious mind to some degree, really responds to images, to symbols. And so when the unconscious mind and the conscious mind come into conflict, the answer that presents itself, and it does so unconsciously, is necessarily a metaphor, an image. It's not a conscious, literal, concrete, like, here, do this, do this, do this. Instead, it's an image of what we should do. And so when Jung says fantasy, it doesn't have to be swords and sorcery. It's just something that doesn't necessarily exist in the concrete world, per se. For me, I was working at a church, and my wife was about to have our son, and I was struggling with, how do I introduce him to this God, this religion that I'm not sure that I'm bought into completely. And I had a real conscious need to be a good boy, to do what I had been raised to do, believe what I had been raised to believe. And my unconscious was pushing me towards something else. And so one night I'm sitting outside a bar getting ready to go and have a drink with some friends, and this idea for a comic just drops fully formed into my lap. I didn't necessarily sit and ponder like, oh, what could this comic be? I want to make a comic about this. It just kind of came to me. And so in that sense, it felt very much like the unconscious conflict between what I thought and what my unconscious was suggesting produced an image. And so I set about the next day and for months afterwards creating this comic, writing it, drawing it, posting it online. And that, to me, when I looked at the whole thing through the rearview mirror, I was like, oh, that was kind of like a hyper sigil, but it was also kind of like the transcendent function that Jung describes. And the conclusion I've come to is they may not be two separate things. They may be the same thing. I can't speak to Grant Morrison's experience with his hyper sigil. I have no desire to speak to anybody else's experience with a hyper sigil. But for me, they kind of seem like you could call it a hyper sigil, or you could call it a transcendent function. And in researching this, I've kind of come to peace with the idea of magic. I describe myself as a rational person, a rational culture, so the idea of something happening by magic doesn't sit well. But I was listening to a podcast with Douglas Rushkoff, who is not an occultist necessarily. He's a media theorist, he's a futurist, but he has done his time in the occult world. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, magic is definitely real, but magic isn't magic. And he went on to say that when you do rituals, when you do exercises that are described as magic, what you're doing is you're making changes to your internal self. So you can't necessarily do a spell to change the outside world, but you can do a spell to change your inside world to make it capable of creating the changes you want to see in the outside world. And then literally days after I listened to that podcast, I read Lon Milo DuQuette's Low Magic, and he says the same thing, that what magic does is it changes your inner world. DuQuette's famous quote is that it's all in your head. Your head is just bigger than you think. And so I'm not saying synchronicities don't happen. I'm not saying weird stuff can't happen. I'm not saying rituals cannot have any effect on the physical world, but the way that I'm able to wrap my mind around them easily, or more easily, is that they change me. These hyper sigils aren't changing my outside world, they're changing my internal world. And with the changes of the internal world, I'm able to affect my surroundings. Does that make sense? And also, I was listening to an interview with Jason Louv, who teaches magic in his magic.me website, and is, as far as I can tell, one of the foremost voices in magic and occult and ceremonial magic, and he's done all the things, and he says the same thing. These aren't ways to throw fireballs and disappear and teleport and make piles of money appear in your life, but it's ways of changing your internal self. And when you change your internal self, the external reactions feel like magic. You're able to do things that seem like magic to other people, that seem like magic to yourself, because you weren't able to do them as the person you were. And so all of that together, Grant Morrison's idea of hyper sigils, my experience with a hyper sigil, my discovery of Jung's concept of the transcendent function, combined with these explanations of what magic really is, all kind of lined up for me at the same time. And so my hyper sigil, as I understand it, and I'm not speaking to anyone else, I'm not giving how-tos, I'm not giving step-by-step processes, I'm not commenting on your experience can be your experience. I'm talking about my experience. My experience seems like what happened with this hyper sigil was that I changed my internal world, and that necessarily knocked down dominoes in my external world. And so that's how a hyper sigil can be definitely real, definitely exist, but not be magic. Or if it is magic, but magic isn't magic, if that makes sense. So I have no doubt that some people will resonate with this and some people will absolutely hate it, and that's fine. Tell me in the comments, lay it on me, give it to me, I don't care. But for me, this was kind of revelatory, and it made sense of a situation that I've been trying to make sense of for 10 years. And it's given me a path forward into exploring and experimenting with hyper sigils, because they are produced by the unconscious. That means there are a limited number of things I can do. Like, I can't just decide I'm going to create this comic and it's going to change my reality, and sit down and come up with an idea and it changed my reality. My unconscious mind has to have a pretty big vote in the whole thing, which you could argue, anything you come up with consciously is influenced by the unconscious, and obviously it is, but there have to be moments of intuition that take over in this creation process. And how do you do that? Well, that's some of the stuff I'm going to be talking about going forward. So thank you for watching this. Thank you for helping me pass the time while I get my brake pads changed. More to come.